tonight to listen to Bill's presentation. And I just want to preface that with what the competition rules say about master's presentations, just so that we're all on the same page. It says the master's presentation will be a photographic presentation and lecture of a minimum of 45 minutes in length in the medium of the candidate's choice. The purposes of the presentation are to educate the club members and to demonstrate the candidate's proficiency in a specific area. So the process of all of this is that the master's candidates submit an outline to the advancement committee early on in the year. And the advancement committee goes through and reviews it and provides feedback. And the outline that Bill submitted is titled My Journey in Crop Factors. I think that's a little bit different than what was publicized for tonight. I think it's the notice that went out said it's My Journey in Crop Sensors. But looking at the outline, I think that they're very closely tied together. So it really shouldn't matter. But I can tell you this, after looking at the outline, I think everyone's going to get a lot of benefit out of this. And I'm sure that Bill, with his technical background and just looking at the photos that he's submitted in the club, is way deep in this subject. And we're going to learn something. Every one of us will probably learn something from this presentation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bill.
Okay, thank you, Greg. That's very kind. Appreciate that. Okay, let me share my screen. Make sure I share the right screen. So you should see image of a sensor with a Journey in Crop Sensors as a title on your screen. All look good? Okay, and then I have to move some windows around so I can see my speaker notes. And okay, I'm ready to go. So my title was indeed Crop Factors when I first wrote that outline about a year ago. And then I changed it for some reason to Crop Sensors, but I'm going to talk a lot about crop factors. So it probably doesn't really matter. So I'm starting with this image to show how important the size of the sensor is. The sensor, just a tiny little chip, but it determines the size of your camera, your lenses, everything, because the lenses have to be large enough diameter to focus on the sensor. There's a second aspect of the size of the sensor, which is a little less obvious, and that is that for a given focal length, it determines the magnification of the image. It does that in a sort of a cropping manner. And I'll get into that in probably more detail than you're interested in seeing. But that's a large part of the topic tonight. So my talk is in two parts. The first half, and my talk will be about an hour in length. The first half is going to be about many years of annual backpacking trips in Alaska. Where a small camera was all I had room for, and a small camera with a long zoom lens made possible by a very tiny sensor. The second half will cover some of the photographic advantages and disadvantages of small camera sensors, and some hopefully useful tips that I've picked up along the way. But first, let me start off by defining crop sensors and crop factors. So this is an image of a strip of film. The width of the film, including the sprocket holes, is 35 millimeters. The image size, the area, is 24 by 36. And in the digital world, digital camera world, the full frame sensor is the same size, 24 by 36 millimeters. Canon, Nikon, Leica, Sony, Panasonic all make full frame cameras. Now, when people talk about crop sensors, they're usually talking about the APS-C sensor, which is a film standard size. It's used in several brands of cameras, and it's smaller than a full frame sensor. How small is basically determined by the crop factor. And the crop factor is defined, shown here. It's the diagonal of the full frame sensor, which is 43.2 millimeters, divided by the diagonal of the sensor in question, in this case, 28.3. So that works out to be about 1.5. Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, Ricoh all make products with APS-C sensors. In the case of Canon, it's slightly smaller, so the crop factor is 1.6. Micro Four Thirds is another format standard. It's smaller. It's also has a 4:3 aspect ratio, as you might expect, instead of 3:2. And the crop factor for Micro Four Thirds is 2. Panasonic, Leica, Olympus at this time were the 3 manufacturers of Micro Four Thirds. So this table shows a lot of crop factors, starting with large format 4x5 inches, where the crop factor is 0.3, medium 0.8, full frame 1.0, all the way down to smartphones, which run about 8. That means the diagonal of a smartphone sensor is about 1/8 the diagonal of a 35 millimeter or of a full frame sensor. So a lot of numbers here, and you're probably wondering at this point, is this going to be a talk about a bunch of numbers? Why should I care about crop factors? Well, here's why I care about crop factors anyway, because it's sort of an image magnification factor. With a crop sensor, you get a magnified view with a smaller camera. And so as a result, the sensor size has a huge impact on the weight of your camera gear. The example shown here is a 300 millimeter zoom that's designed for a Micro Four Thirds camera with a crop factor of 2. It has the same field of view. When you look through the viewfinder, it has the same field of view, same magnification as a full frame camera with a 600 millimeter zoom. And you can see the difference in size. These are just 2 images I took off the manufacturer websites and scaled them to the same scale. So now I'm going to jump into Alaska. And this should become clear why I'm doing this at some point here, but I'll talk about first about backpacking in Alaska. The gentleman on the right, you'll see a few more pictures of him, is Mike Paradis. Mike is an old friend. We started the tradition of an annual backpacking trip about 20 years ago. And in 2005, we did our first backpacking trip in Alaska, typically 2-week backpacking trips. So we were dropped off by plane near this point on the Chittystone River, and had to hike up this canyon, basically over the ridge on beyond to the next canyon over to an area called Skolai Valley, where the pilot had agreed to pick us up. And my beloved 35 millimeter SLR with 2 lenses, mind you, stayed home. A little too bulky for backpacking, and I didn't want to get it wet. And at that point, I was getting pretty interested in digital photography. I had some connections at work made me interested in digital photography. So I carried a small pocket camera with a 3x zoom. It had served me well in the backpacking trips in the Sierras. Fit easily in a jacket pocket, could take it out and take a picture anywhere, sort of like now with a cell phone. In those days, this is the sort of thing you could carry with you at all times. Well, we eventually reached Skolai Valley, and the scenery was great. It's a valley that's surrounded by glaciers, and we did see wildlife. The reason we were going to Alaska was to see wildlife. But it was a little bit of a disappointment because they were hard to get close enough to get a decent picture. As soon as they saw us, they were pretty much gone. Did get some shots of these mountain caribou. And in fact, it was during this trip that we learned about the massive herds of caribou in the far north of Alaska. And we spotted a bear. And this is my first photograph of a bear.
Where is it?
Where is it, you say? It's kind of brown, and it's down to the bottom of that slope right there. And with binoculars, it was easy to see it was a bear. With my 3x zoom and cropping substantially, you can sort of make out that it's a bear. Actually, it was worse than a bear. It was 4 bears. It was a bear and 3 cubs. And so we stayed up on our ridge and watched with binoculars. And that was kind of a turning point in my photographic life, because I realized I needed a better camera, a longer zoom. Either they wouldn't come close to us, or we didn't want to go close to them. That was clear for these backpacking trips in Alaska. And for the next trip, I bought a better camera. I bought a compact zoom with effective focal range from 35 millimeters to 420 millimeters. All the focal lengths I'm giving are to 35 millimeter equivalents. And it met my needs. It was a compromise in that it couldn't fit in my jacket pocket. I had to strap it across my chest with a harness, but I could easily carry it with me wherever we hiked. And we decided to go further north to see caribou. And in fact, we got sort of obsessed over the years in photographing caribou and all the different stages of their lives and migration cycle and so forth. So we decided to go to Gates of the Arctic National Park and also this area to the west, which is where one of the major caribou herds tends to hang out. Now, this area above the Arctic Circle is one of the last wildernesses in the world. It's of this size. It's about the size of the state of Oregon or state of Colorado. The only population centers are just small villages, like Bettles is only 25 people, just a few around the periphery because the winters are pretty severe. So this is all wildlife. This is all wilderness, with the exception of the oil pipeline that runs down here. Everything else is all wilderness. And it has the largest population of caribou, largest population of grizzlies, largest population of wolves in the world in this area. So we basically made repeated trips over the next several years, 10 years or so. We would either hire a plane here in Bettles and get dropped off in Gates of the Arctic National Park, or hire a plane in Kotzebue and get dropped off further west where we could see more caribou. This is a view from the plane heading into Gates of the Arctic and the Brooks Range. And this is a typical campsite, lightweight tents, food storage containers that are bear-proof, a couple of cook pots for boiling water to pour into freeze-dried meals, and a solar charger for my camera batteries. And I love that zoom camera. I could take pictures like this with a little Arctic squirrel here in the foreground, and then zoom in with a flick of the wrist and get a good close-up. And that became kind of my style in Alaska, taking pictures of animals, trying to get as close as I could and zoom in so I could see what I was looking at. This is a bull caribou in full splendor. This is a maximum zoom of the camera. Came over the ridge, he was there, took his picture, and he was gone. 4 bulls on a ridge above the Killick River, also maximum zoom. And for the next few years, I upgraded about every 2 years to the latest compact zoom camera. The specs were getting better every year, so they were changing pretty rapidly. Basically changed into a camera with a wider zoom range, more megapixels, and improvements in the anti-shake software. All my shots were taken handheld, so that was pretty useful at those long zoom lengths. And over the following years, I photographed a lot of caribou. This is in 2015, a very unique situation. The air was smoky from a wildfire a couple hundred miles to the south. But in this little canyon, in about 12 hours, about 90,000 caribou filed past our 2 tents. It's a unique behavior that the caribou do that happens about once a year, and it happens when the mosquitoes get really intense. And they just all come together in these huge herds for about a week to 2 weeks and then disperse. Hard to see, it always happens in a very remote location. A lot of people have seen it from the air, but few people have actually been able to see it on the ground. I can let Tim in a sec here. There he goes. So, but that's enough about caribou. I'm going to talk about bears. And bears were always on my mind, at least in Alaska. Our first close encounter with a bear took place in 2013 in Gates of the Arctic National Park. We paddled about 100 miles down the Noatak River in pack rafts. So pack rafts are these small inflatable rafts. You can carry them in a pack. They don't weigh much. Pump them up and strap your pack across the bow when you're ready to go. It's a great way, particularly in that area, because there are no trails, no roads, no trails. And so you really rely on the rivers to get you any kind of distance if you're going to cover some distance. So a typical trip would be paddle for a day, set up camp, and then hike around that area wherever you are, and then paddle another day and so forth. It's a great way to go. I still have my pack raft. So that trip I had a Panasonic Lumix FC200 with a focal range from 25 to 600 millimeters, which still seems pretty amazing to me at f2.8 over the entire zoom range. The rubber strap is for strapping it to my chest, and I basically carried that camera everywhere I went. And I still have this one camera. The others I've sold in order to buy other cameras, but this one I've kept. So we were about a week into the trip. We stopped paddling for the day. It was windy and cold, and we're paddling into a headwind the whole time. So tired. I was tightening the cords on my tent that you see here. Mike already had his binoculars out, and he spotted a bear. Spotted a bear up by that white strip, which turns out to be cotton grass. And through my camera, I could see that it was clearly a bear, and we watched. And after a while, a second bear appeared, and we watched as they slowly made their way up the ridge and then over, and then they disappeared out of sight. And bears in this area are dangerous because they are not used to humans. Very few humans. There's not a lot of bear hunting in this area. We don't have the big salmon runs in the far north, so they're hungry and they're eating anything they can find. And they're not afraid of humans because they haven't learned to fear humans yet. Anyway, the bears disappeared, went back to the normal camp routine. I washed some clothes in the river, tied them up to willows to dry, heated some water for dinner. The wind was blowing really strongly from the right to left in this image. And I was just pouring hot water into a container of freeze-dried white bean chili with chicken. I'll never forget when Mike said, Bill, look up, and we had 4 bears marching into our camp. There you can see Mama on the far right, and 2 of the younger ones kind of mid, and the third, the younger bear, was just off to the right, out of the range of the camera. As soon as he said, I grabbed the camera and started taking pictures. The smallest bear, the dark on the left, was the most aggressive. He was coming in, no doubt about it. So we jumped up and started yelling and waving our arms. I'm holding the camera in one hand and waving my arm with the other. And they retreated. And thinking about this over the years, I've decided that they were probably just as surprised to see us as we were them. They're probably following their noses. The wind was blowing our food smells right at them, the willows. So they came right out of the willows and into our camp. And, then suddenly they see a couple of wild men yelling at them. So they retreated. They went back across this little creek and then stopped out in the willows just beyond the creek and started watching us. And we stood here watching them. Um, they were grazing, but then looking at us. Here you can see all four. See there are four bears. Um, and they weren't leaving, which was troubling. In fact, it looked like more like they were sort of sizing us up. We've learned over the years that it's never a good sign when a bear actually makes eye contact with you, you personally. Most of the time you see a bear, they act like they didn't even see you. They have seen you, of course, but they don't spend a lot of time worrying about you. When they do make eye contact is usually not a good sign. So we decided to hustle back to our camp, cover up the food, and deal with whatever came next. And here they came. This guy in the lead. And I was closest when he got to our camp and saw it about 10 feet. I gave him a quick blast of bear spray, pepper spray. And he sort of put on the brakes and looked away and never looked back, never looked at us again. Just stood there and started chewing on some willow leaves. And that was pretty much it. They slowly, I guess they didn't want to show fear. They very slowly grazed away from us. It took about an hour for them to disappear up the ridge and before they were finally gone. So we both carry a can of bear spray on our belts. And after that incident, I bought a signal flare pistol. I'd heard that particularly in southern Alaska where bears are a little more accustomed to humans and they know about guns, that a flare pistol, which makes a loud noise and sends out a ball of fire, is pretty effective at scaring off a bear. And the nice thing about it, actually, is after going through this, is that it gives you something to do while you're waiting for the bear to get closer. With pepper spray, you can't, it's totally ineffective until 10 feet. So I had that flare pistol when we spotted this guy a few years later. This is 2016 in Gates of the Arctic. This was a pack rafting trip down the Killick River. And we had just set up camp and we're hiking around to see what there was to see. And Mike spotted this bear on this far ridge. Oops, sorry. This far ridge, upright. And then he just sort of came trotting down, grazed a little bit, came a little closer, grazed some more, and just kept coming. So at about 40 yards, I dropped the camera and fired the flare pistol. And the ball of fire sailed way over his head. That was a bad shot. Landed behind him. Didn't startle him. He just watched it very calmly as it went behind him into the brush, then turned back and looked at us and resumed his approach. 3 more flares, 2 landing just in front of him, and he finally lost interest and slowly wandered off. Again, it was about an hour before we finally lost sight of him and quit watching, quit looking for him. Looking back, I think this may have been our most dangerous bear encounter. Now, at that time, those last 2 pictures I took with this camera. So in 2015, I switched to a micro 4/3. I had more versatility with this, a little better autofocus. Was taking better shots in the wider angle area as well. So a telephoto lens, which is what I took those bear shots with, a macro lens, and then a wide angle zoom. So telephoto zoom, wide angle zoom. With 1 camera back, I later added a second camera back. These were Panasonic camera backs, and all for 4.5 pounds, which was important because my pack, basically the most I can handle is about 40 pounds with a well established pack. And I know a few of you are backpackers and might be interested in this. The base total of my weight, pack weight, carrying everything that is needed for survival, sleeping bag, food, satellite phone to contact the pilot, and so forth, extra rain gear, comes to about 25 pounds. Then on top of that, you have 10 pounds for the pack raft. So that leaves me 5 pounds for the camera gear, and that's where that 4.5 pounds worked out pretty nicely. Now I'll finish the backpacking discussion with the most recent trip. This was in 2018 trip to Kodiak Island. We hired a plane in the town of Kodiak, and it dropped us off in the southwestern part of the island at Fraser Lake. Fraser Lake is off in the distance. This is the outlet from Fraser Lake. So we hiked not very far, just a few miles up to this ridge where you could set up camp. And the reason we picked that spot is because there was a fish ladder up the Fraser Falls. It's right below us. And the fish ladder that was put in the 60s by the Fish and Game, Alaska Fish and Game Department. It's kind of interesting. They put that in to allow the sockeye salmon a way to get to the lake. Sockeye salmon are number one, probably the most highly prized for eating in Alaska, sockeye salmon. And secondly, they're very particular about where they spawn. They only spawn in lakes. So I put this fish ladder in just to get a run of sockeye salmon every year. So in mid-August, the spawning run takes place. The salmon congregate outside the entrance to the fish ladder, and that brings the bears. In fact, you can see 4 bears in this photograph. One here, obviously, but there's one over here and 2 more right here, 2 young ones. So every morning, we were there about a week and a half. Every morning we would hike down to the river and photograph bears. And here the bears are more interested in salmon than in us. Would I do this a month before or a month after? I'm not so sure. But that month, there was so much to eat for the bears that they were just totally absorbed in filling their stomachs all day long, and a good share of the evenings as well. Some just waited out looking for fish, some charging in from the bank on the side, and when they spot a fish. This particular bear we watched eat 20 salmon in an afternoon, 8 pounds each roughly. So it's quite amazing how much food they have. And that's why for us, we felt pretty safe. They've got winter hibernation to fatten up for, and they're just really busy eating. Probably for this reason that Kodiak bears are the largest bears in the world. They have just more to eat. This was a young mother, young bear with young cubs, yearlings. She was catching fish all day long that she shared with the cubs. She had 3 cubs, and then was still nursing the cubs as well, and then occasionally giving us a wary look. But we had bear spray and the flare pistol and really never felt threatened by the bears that we saw this trip. So I'll end with this shot. I think some of you have seen this before. This is that same bear. She would work all morning until around noon and then take the cubs up to this little spot which she'd carved out of the bank, and they'd take an hour to a 2-hour nap and then go right back to work again. Okay. That's only about 25 minutes, so doing pretty good. If we want to take a break now, it'd be probably a decent time to take a break, or we can just power through it. I've got about another half hour for my.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
On the little pack raft, when you're out there in the river, did you encounter rapids, or how do you know what the water's going to be like up ahead?
That's a story in its own right. That's very challenging because much as we could study up on the rivers, there are rapids, and in fact, we managed to flip our rafts in one occasion, and it's very cold water and so forth. It's quite an experience, but yeah, you study up as much as you can, and when you approach something that, if you see the water with a straight line across it, that's always a bad sign. Head for the shore of those situations. But yeah, that's pretty much most of the time is spent navigating around the big rocks and making sure you don't get into something that's a little more than you can handle.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
So what camera do you use now?
I use the Micro Four Thirds Olympus. I'll show you a little later. But I've switched from the Panasonic to Olympus for the fast autofocus that I have. It's a 20 megapixel Micro Four Thirds.
Hey, Bill, that first encounter with the four bears, as you were telling the story, I was thinking, where do you stow your food? And then you launched into the answer to that question. And then I'm thinking, did you sleep at all that night? Because if it was me, my adrenaline would be so high, I would not be able to sleep for like 2 days.
Well, I sleep very lightly on these trips. I'm normally, my wife will tell you, I normally am dead at night. I just fall asleep completely. But in Alaska, you're always hearing things and are always sleeping very lightly.
Yeah.
So that night I slept okay, but you wake up in the middle of the night and you're listening to, then you go back to sleep and then you wake up again, and then it starts getting cold. It always gets cold around 3 in the morning. And so you have to put some extra clothes on anyway. So then you can kind of check, see what it looks like. But it's a different experience than being nice and safe in your bedroom.
Are you planning another trip soon?
I hope so. We're talking about it. I haven't really got it nailed down yet, but I think so, yes.
All right,
I'm impressed. I can't even imagine.
great.
It's a lot of fun.
Well, what time of the year do you normally go?
Well, all 3 times. Going in the spring in order to see when the calves are being born. They're born within about a 2-week period. And so that's pretty exciting, the caribou calves.
Wow.
Middle of the summer is when the mosquitoes come out, but that's when this massive aggregation takes place. So we did that. Fall is probably the best time in terms of the colors, the beauty of the place, and the beauty of the animals as well. But all 3.
Wonderful.
Never in the winter.
No snowshoeing?
How long is a typical trip?
2 weeks, typically 2 weeks. That's as much stuff as I can carry on my back. 2 weeks of food is 10 pounds, and we go through most of it. So that pretty much sets the time limit. We don't want to have food located in different locations, because we want to be able to just go wherever it looks interesting, wherever the animals are.
How about water though?
Plenty of water in Alaska.
Oh, you could drink it all. Does it?
Yeah. Well, I use chemicals, so purification tablets.
Mhm.
I actually use chlorine dioxide. That works pretty good.
Mhm.
But there's water everywhere. We don't carry very much water with us because it's so
Heavy.
readily available.
Did you ever lose any food to bears?
No,
Huh.
no, never. The bear cans work great. Usually set them outside away from the tent, but never saw any signs that a bear was interested. But in this area, bears are not used to seeing humans.
Mhm.
And again, can't emphasize that enough. Actually, they see you and they first not. I think they're not sure whether you're a bear, are you a threat or what, or just food. They do something there called the bluff charge, which a bear will spot you because there's no trees. It's all tundra, and they'll come running right toward you and stop at about 20 feet short of being on top of you, and that's kind of exciting. And
I
then,
have a heart attack.
then if you don't run, then they just kind of stand there and then wander off. If you run, that would not be good. Then it's a bad ending.
Huh.
Okay, shall I jump to the second half?
Sure.
Okay, coming back to crop factors and crop sensors. So why is the crop factor a magnification multiplier? Why do you get an increase in magnification by just reducing the size of the sensor? And full disclosure, I kind of imply by this image that The one on the left was taken with a full frame camera, and the one on the right was taken with a 2x crop factor camera. It's not the case at all. The image on the right was just cropped down so I could show the difference between 1x and 2x magnification, just for illustration purposes. So to explain that, it's pretty simple. So just a sketch of a simple ray diagram for a digital camera. And the large double-ended orange arrow, that represents the field of view. And that's brought to a focus on the sensor by whatever lens system you have in your camera. And so now if that sensor, if you suddenly reduce that sensor, make it smaller, take that one out and put a smaller one in, what happens? Well, you get a cropped image. You get a magnified image because now that crop sensor is only seeing a portion of that field of view. And it's using less of the beam to make that image, because this green area now is the area of the original field of view that you're projecting onto the sensor. And so it's a smaller diameter beam. That means you can use a smaller diameter lens, which means you can design a smaller camera around that lens. And so you end up with something like this with a crop sensor camera, smaller. Now, if we go back to a full frame camera and you ask the question, what will it take to get that same magnified view with your full frame camera? Well, you want to get that green portion of the field of view now spread entirely across the sensor in a full frame camera. So to do that, you increase the focal length to something like that. So that's basically the difference between the two. A crop sensor camera gets that same magnification with a shorter focal length than a full frame camera. And they're related, those two focal lengths, by the crop factor. This is not obvious at all, but it turns out that the focal length for the full frame camera is divided by the crop sensor camera focal length is equal to the crop factor. We define the crop factor as just a ratio of diagonals. So this is not obvious, but you can work through the geometry of diagrams like this, and that's what comes out of it. And so that's what's illustrated here, that a camera with a crop factor of 2 with a 300 millimeter lens designed for a smaller sensor displays the same magnified image as a full frame camera with a 600 millimeter lens. Now, some people call this reach. So ability to resolve details at a distance, and reducing the field of view provides more reach, but that's not the whole story. What's also important are the pixels. For example, if the image on the right were taken with a crop sensor with 16 megapixels, then you could get the exact same reach with a full frame camera with a 64 megapixel sensor. It's a factor of 4 because it goes by the area, the megapixels. So if you had a full frame camera with a 64 megapixel, you could crop the image either in post-processing, or you could do it probably in camera. They're just by deactivating the pixels around it and turning it into a 16 megapixel sensor. Then you would get the exact same field of view at the same magnification. If you had a 20 megapixel crop sensor camera, then a full frame camera that's 80 megapixel will give you exactly the same reach. Some wildlife photographers refer to this as pixels on the duck. What counts are the pixels that you get on the duck. In this case, it's pixels on the bear. Now I'll go through some examples taken with my camera, actually a couple of cameras that I have had with a crop factor of 2 and a long focal length lens. This is 600 millimeter equivalent, crop factor of 2. This was taken from the pack rafts. I didn't crop the image. I just got pretty close to him and took this from the pack raft. I took this in Spring Lake in Santa Rosa. I found that from a pack raft in Spring Lake, the birds will pretty much let you get pretty close without taking action. Whereas if I go crashing through the brush, they're gone in a flash. So that's kind of a nice plus coming from the pack rafts. This was taken with this handheld with the 800 millimeter lens, handheld, crop factor of 2. And this is bees and blooms. I focused on the flower petals. You can't focus on moving bees or wasps or whatever they are. They're so fast, but I could focus on the flower, and then in burst mode, got about a dozen images as he came cruising in to investigate the flower. And I got really lucky. He turned out to be carrying a housefly for the hungry larva back at the nest, and that definitely made the shot. So long focal lengths tend to magnify the slightest camera motion. And it's taken me a long time to get to a point where I can reliably get sharp images, particularly handheld, but even from a tripod, of moving critters, moving animals, moving people. So this is some of the things I do, or at least that worked out pretty well for me. Back button focus, I got that tip from Terry, actually. I use back button focus, and I'm continually updating the autofocus with my thumb. And then when I want to take a shot, I'm pressing down with my forefinger on the shutter release. Sequential shooting at about 20 frames per second. Continuous autofocus. In other words, once you hit the shutter release, it tries to maintain focus on whatever it is that it's focused on. If it moves, it tries to move with it, which makes a big difference. Electronic shutter to reduce the vibration. The mechanical shutter doesn't have much vibration, but I see definitely a higher percentage of good sharp images with electronic shutter than with mechanical shutter. So I think that's probably what's going on there. If I have to shoot handheld, elbows in, nice and rigid, no vibration. And if possible, I try to steady it with a tripod with a slightly loose ball mount. Now, what I mean by that is, if you're holding a camera, you've got 6 degrees of freedom that you're trying to control. You have 3 positional degrees of freedom: left, right, up, down, in, and out. And then you have 3 angular degrees of freedom, 3 axes of rotation for the camera. So with the tripod, at least you can fix the positional degrees of freedom and then try to control the 3 angular movements. Usually, in order to follow whatever it is, I need a ball mount. I can't be sure what plane that the subject's going to be moving in. So I just try to control that as best I can. And I tighten up the ball mount just so there's a little bit of drag, but not too much. So it doesn't stick, but it can move smoothly and not flop around and be too loose. So this was taken with the loose tripod, 800 millimeter equivalent focal length. In this particular case, I had the river between me and the bears, and I felt pretty safe. This bear actually appeared behind me on the same side of the river, but I knew she was there, and she had cubs that were well away from me. I was not anywhere close to the cubs, and she had disappeared into the brush through this patch of fireweed. And so I waited and waited, hoping she might come back through the fireweed. So I get a picture of her and the colors of the fireweed. And finally she did after about half an hour, 45 minutes. It's such a beautiful animal.
Yeah.
Okay, polo fields. Polo fields are large. They're longer and wider than a football field. You can put about 9 9 football fields into one polo field. And the sport is played on horseback at a full gallop. And so they're all over that field. And I find this to be the most challenging photography that I do in terms of getting good, sharp action shots, because they're just always on the move in all directions. So I'm moving with the zoom in and out, all the different values of the zoom, as well as using all those different angular degrees of freedom to follow the players. And I found it's been great practice for me. I've gotten better at getting sharp images by just going over there and practicing by trying to follow these polo players. I carry a second camera on a shoulder strap at the polo field. And the nice thing about a tripod compared to say a monopod is that you can leave the camera on it and it doesn't fall over. So when the action is close by and too close for the zoom, the telephoto zoom, I can trot over with my second camera, wide zoom, and take shots like this one. This shot, kind of a big hit with the polo crowd. I don't think I would ever submit it for competition, but it's been a lot of fun because the polo players never stand on horseback. And so it got like 2,000 likes on an Argentinian Instagram site. One of the players posted it there, and it was also featured in a US polo magazine. Okay, now the downside. I've been telling you all these great things about small sensors and how light they are and small the cameras are, easy to use. The downside is noise, image noise. And to illustrate image noise, I'll start with this photo. This is a trip my wife and I took in 2010 in Turkey, a balloon trip. This shot was taken right after our balloon got in the air, and morning light. It was a great trip, actually. This was taken with that camera, compact zoom, 12 megapixel, and crop factor of 6, so a pretty tiny sensor. And if you look carefully in this lower region, I'll go back to that in a second, but if I get my cursor over here, if you look in this region, in the lower region, you'll see there is noise that's visible. Noise tends to show up in the shady areas. And cropping into that rectangle, then you can see it more clearly here. So it's noise across the entire image, but notice how the noise is much less in the lighter areas. It's a low light phenomenon, the noise that you get. Much more visible in the shadows. And this is a fact of life. The smaller the sensor, the more noise you'll see under low light conditions. Really big sensors, less the case. If you go to large format, for example, you go to small cell phones, it's going to be more so. Although the cell phones are getting pretty good now with digital manipulation to disguise and hide the noise instead of you having to do it. Anyway, I guess two questions this brings up is, why is that? Why should a smaller sensor have more noise in the low light areas? And then secondly, what can you do about it? So why is that? Well, here's a simple analogy that is often used to explain image noise in modern cameras. It's sort of a photon rain analogy. So light's made up of photons, and at low light levels, it's sort of analogous to a light rain, where the droplets correspond to photons. Now imagine you want to go out in that rainstorm and measure the amount of water that's coming down. If you go out with a bunch of small test tubes, there'll be quite a bit of variability from one test tube to the next as to what you measure. You hold them, put them all out there for the same period of time, and some will have more water than others. Whereas if you have big test tubes, big wide ones, you get more of an averaging of the droplets, the variability of the droplets, and you'll get pretty much the same measurement. And so that's the phenomenon we're talking about. It's the variability of the photons under low light conditions. And if you have large sensors, you won't see as much noise as you will under with small sensors. Another way to look at that, if you're comfortable with signal to noise ratios and that sort of thing, so probably means you have an engineering background, then a smaller sensor system produces a smaller signal than a large sensor. So smaller sensor, small signal, large sensor, large signal. But the noise that's superimposed in that signal is the same in both cases because it's the variability of the photons hitting the sensor. So large signal to noise is worse than a camera with a small sensor. So what can you do? Well, more light on the subject, always good. I try to keep the sun at my back for wildlife, for sports shots, mostly because I want to make sure the eye of the person or animal is clearly visible. And the more light I can get on that, the better. But actually, for example, in polo, some of my best shots have been with backlighting because you have the hair of the horse and some of the players that adds quite a bit to the image. Indoors, fill flash, of course, is better. Also better illumination or better composition for your shot. And you can fix it in post-processing. So I'll focus more on the latter, what to do in post-processing to reduce noise. So to explain what I do, let me first say what my workflow is for processing images. And I'm sure it's not much different from yours. For file management, I happen to use Windows File Manager instead of Lightroom. And so then I have Adobe Bridge in order to select the image that I'm going to work on. It goes automatically into Adobe Camera Raw for all of the global adjustments and then the local adjustments with Photoshop. I know many of you use Lightroom and you're probably covering these first two steps with Lightroom. I show all this just to make the statement that it's good to take the noise out before you screw it up and make it worse. Because it's easy to accentuate the noise if you aren't careful, particularly if you do certain sharpening steps. So I take the noise out either in Adobe Camera Raw or as a first layer going into Photoshop. And there are a number of good programs out there for denoise. I like Photoshop a lot. I like Adobe Camera Raw a lot. But lately I've really fallen in love with Topaz Denoise AI. So let's come back to that same picture of the balloons. This is looking at it with Denoise AI. And what I like about this program is that you can dial it in. The problem with removing noise, for me at least, is that you can go too far and it looks weird. You get these weird kind of shiny surfaces. It's easy to go too far and take too much texture out of your image. And Topaz Denoise AI allows you to dial it in very, very accurately. And I like that. So here you see on the left before the denoising and on the right after. And you can see I didn't take all of the noise out in this dark shadowy regions because I wanted to leave some texture in the photograph as well. And you can do that with that program. You can just dial it in to the point where you're comfortable with what you see. This is the final shot. Here's another example. This was a black-capped night heron at a golf course nearby. I went out in the early morning. It was fairly dark. I had the ISO set up at 3200. And then just as the light kind of came up and highlighted this bird, I took the shot and I was at ISO 3200. So there's some noise that you can clearly see in this image. This is with my current camera, which is a Olympus Mark III 20 megapixel, and but with that same long lens, 800 millimeter equivalency, handheld, and with Topaz denoise AI, again dialing it in so you can be sure that the bird's head is detailed as you want it, but get the noise out from behind it. And this shows you the before and after removing the noise. So I like that program. I think it's particularly because it's so easy to use and you can be quite accurate with it. Here's another example. This was taken with a more reasonable ISO setting, but there's still noise, and you can dial it in just a touch of noise removal, 1 out of a scale of 100, to make sure that the feather detail is still retained, but just took the noise out enough to improve the image. Now another program, and Mike talked about this as well last month, Gigapixel AI. This is a pretty amazing program in that it's normally used for upsizing, making large prints, posters, and that sort of thing, to avoid the pixelation that you inevitably will get when you make a really, really large print. So that's kind of the original use for upsizing, but Gigapixel is a little different in that it manages to pull out detail that it detects in your image that is there, but just barely visible. And so I'll often use it, even if I'm not going to make a print, even if I'm not going to do anything more than say an image for the screen at 1920 pixels. Upsize with it and then resize to the desired pixel count. So here's that same night here, and again, image on the left is after denoise that I just showed you, much improved over the original image. And here's after upsizing and then downsizing after gigapixel. And I think you can see some of that feather detail is here that you can't see clearly. You can pretty well see it, but not quite. It just brings it out more clearly. Also, the head features are a lot clearer. So I like this program for that. And for making prints, it's especially useful. For a print where you're looking at an image close up, it definitely brings an improvement. Here's the snowy egret on the left with just denoise and some minor sharpening. On the right with gigapixel, and then some minor sharpening. And you can see there's more detail in the feathers on his neck after the gigapixel treatment. Also a little more detail around the eyes and the beak. So interesting program. Now my last topic for removing noise is image stacking. Image stacking, typically you increase depth of focus by image stacking, called focus stacking, or to reduce noise, called noise stacking, or at least I call it that. So we start with focus stacking, just so it's clear what's what. Here's the simplest form of focus stacking. I took this picture a few years ago, and I was just trying to simulate the pomegranate bursting open and having all the grains flying out. And of course, it never happens. So I took a picture of the pomegranate lying on a piece of velvet and the grains lying next to it, and basically took two images. One focused on the upper surface of the pomegranate about here, and the second image focused on the grains here. Then merged them in Photoshop to give sort of a simulation of what it might look like with these grains flying out in the air. So that's kind of a simple focus stacking, just two images merged in Photoshop. Now the first image of my presentation is 31 images merged. And that's with a rail, focus stacking with a rail. And that's because I had took this picture with a macro lens. Macro lenses are notoriously shallow depth of focus. And so I just couldn't get a decent shot no matter where I focused. And with a rail, you basically take one shot, focus the first image, and then leave the focus. Don't touch it, and just keep moving the camera. Do one rotation on the screw drive, and then take another shot, and so forth until you've covered the full range from the sensor all the way out to this little pin on the outside. And then you can stack them with Photoshop, which is very, very tedious because the alignment with Photoshop is not easy. Or you can stack them with something called Helicon Focus. Now, Mike put me on to Helicon Focus. Really grateful for it. It's a great little program. It's about $30 a year. But what it does is it makes this so simple, so quick that for me, it's well worth the $30. My subscription just ran out recently. I had to renew it. I bought in for another $30. Actually, I took that picture of the rail with the same approach, focus stacking, because I couldn't get that image sharp over the full length. Now, image stacking to reduce noise. With the pandemic, I've been interested in night photography, night sky, things I can do close to home. And I have to say, I make no claims to being a great night sky photographer. And there are a number of members of the club who know a lot more about this topic than I do. But it's one I'm very interested in. I've always had a telescope, and I was interested to see if a small sensor camera, which is sensitive to noise, and this is kind of the worst case situation for low light noise, namely night sky photography, was interested to see what it could do with image stacking. So this is the moon photographed with 800 millimeter lens. It's the original view before any kind of cropping. And this is closer look. And I think you can see there is noise in this image, there, particularly in this area. But actually, the more you look at it, the more noise you see. But 10 images, 10 identical images taken one after another and then superimposed, it sharpens it up quite a bit. And I can show you side by side here. You can see with one image on the left, the noise is pretty apparent, but with 10 images stacked, it's greatly improved the detail in the image. And that was with 10 images. You can stack 100 images if you so desire. The program I use for that is called Auto Stackert. It's free, and it has a program that's used to prepare the images first, which is called PIP, Planetary Image Pre-Processing. And I've got a slide that shows all of these names at the end of my talk. Now, my final example is sculpture at the polo field, night sky. And this is for the situation where you'd like to get, you want a night sky image and you want something in the foreground sharp as well. And this is pretty challenging because for one image, of course, is not challenging. You take the shot, that's what you see on the left. But to stack 10 images is an interesting challenge. And I think first of all, you can see there's improvement. The noise in the sky is definitely cleaned up a bit with 10 images. And secondly, even the sculpture of the horse is cleaned up a bit. The noise that you see on this image is greatly reduced. The challenging part, this is the full image. Challenging part is that the stars are moving and the horse isn't. These are 15-second images, and just I couldn't go more than 15 seconds because I wanted to avoid any kind of star tracing effects. But each shot, the stars have moved slightly with respect to the horse, or I guess we're moving around the sun and the stars are fixed. But anyway, there's a relative movement stars to horse. And so to stack an image like this is where Sequator comes into play. This is a really pretty amazing program, and it allows you to sort of paint in where the sky is, and then it takes it from there. It stacks images such that all the terrestrial objects are stacked, and all the night sky objects are stacked to form one image. It's a great program, and it's free. One more thing to mention about night sky photography for this image is the hyperfocal distance. So the hyperfocal distance is the distance that keeps the stars sharp, the closest focusing distance that keeps the stars sharp. So how close can you get to the horse and still get the stars sharp as well? There's a simple formula for calculating that, but there's an even simpler app. In fact, there are many apps out there that will calculate that for you. I like photo pills because I'm using it already just for keeping track of where things are going to be on certain days and certain times. And it has a little app in there that will tell you what the subject distance should be if you tell it what the focal length is and what the aperture size is. Very simple, easy to use, and I found it really, really useful. Okay, I think I've come to the end of my talk. I'll summarize. Covered a lot of different topics. So talked about sensor size, determining the size of the camera and the lens. I gave you a lot of examples of backpacking in Alaska with a small camera and a long zoom. Crop factor is a magnification factor, which is good, but smaller sensors are also more prone to image noise. And I covered a few things you can do to reduce image noise, including image stacking for night sky photography. Here's the products that I've covered. The three Topaz products, I covered denoise a lot. It's a little bit about gigapixel. I didn't say much about Topaz Sharpen, but I bought the bundle together, all three. It's about $170 for all three, permanent license. I think they give you upgrades for the first year. And I find it very useful. Topaz Sharpen is pretty slow, pretty amazing. Images where you just miss it, you miss a shot, but not quite. So it's just a little soft. I found that it would save an image that otherwise looked like it wasn't going to make it. It's slow, at least in my computer. Computer can spend 5 to 10 minutes working with Topaz Sharpen AI. So I don't use it very often. Normally, if I do any sharpening at all, I use Photoshop. But it's a really good program. And Mike, in his talk last month, he covered these three programs as well. I think we're both saying pretty much the same things. These are pretty useful programs. Helicon Focus, I mentioned. Mike has in fact put me onto that. And then the two stacking programs for night sky and photo pills. Focusing rail I use, there are a lot of them out there. I like this one because it's machined from a block of aluminum. It's not expensive, better than the plastic and cast metal ones that I saw. Okay, that covers my talk. I want to thank a lot of people. Thank all the members for amazing photography suggestions and being generous with their time. Thinking of people like Tim Allen and Nancy Goodenough, Terry Connolly, Tony Reynes, the volunteers, the officers, Mike Funk, Joel, Tricia, Nick Allen, Tony Reynes again, and most of all, Steve Munch with his technical skills and willingness to put in a lot of time for the club. I really think he has made a huge difference for the club this past year. Tim reviewed the technical discussion in this talk, and my wife, who is pretty good at image critique, and she's always got a lot of good ideas of things to photograph. Photography quote. I had a quote on my taped to my monitor for years, and in fact, it's gone through a couple of monitors. In fact, it's a quote by Jim Richardson, who's a photographer for National Geographic, and his quote was, "If you want to be a better photographer, stand in front of more interesting stuff." I try to live by that.
So true.
Okay, that's it. Any questions?
Bill, what ball head do you use?
I have a Gitzo tripod, and so it's a Gitzo ball head. I'd have to look it up and see what the model is. I can surely send that out. Who asked that?
Me, Liz?
Yeah, I can look it up.
Thank you.
Actually, maybe
I have a
have it over
question.
here. No, I don't.
So you
So-
mentioned,
I just want to compliment you. That was fascinating.
Oh, thanks. Great.
Bill, I have a question. Do you use sharpen and denoise at the same time? I mean, do you use them both for the same photo?
Yeah, denoise always early on in the process. Always early on in the process. And the last thing I do if I do any sharpening, it's the last thing I do.
All right, so early on, like how early? Do you do any
Right away.
Photoshop adjustments before you do that?
No, I do not. So the
So
first
you
layer,
do-
the first layer I put in Photoshop, well, basically I make a copy of the first layer and then I add the filter to that. Now, just to avoid making things worse.
So denoise early and
And then
sharpen at the end.
sharpen, if I do any sharpening, and it's usually specific to the size. So resize at the end to whatever it is doing, and then a bit of sharpening at that point.
Thank you.
Bill?
Yeah.
Oh, Nancy, go ahead.
I have a question that relates to what Jennifer just said, because I tend to do it at the end when I'm really messed up with a lot of noise, because I do auto ISO and I go really, really, really high with a crop sensor. And so, but I also know that I want to keep raw as long as possible.
Yeah.
And once I go over, then it's, I would be turning it into a TIFF. So where to find that balance? Now I'm using Capture One and I'm going very far in Capture One. I sometimes don't have to do anything more than Capture One. And so I'm staying in raw, but I'm doing things, I'm pushing things sometimes. So, you know, clarity will bring in a bunch of things that I do, bring in a lot of noise. So where would I find that balance of staying as long as possible in raw and going to the AI, denoise AI?
Well, for me, I denoise as early as I can because I get artifacts from the noise when I start processing it. But you may be doing some things where it's a little different. But in general, I take out the noise early on, and then I stay in raw all the way to the bitter end, and then the final image is going to be a JPEG, and then I'll sharpen the JPEG. Never sharpen raw.
But how are you keeping it raw after you denoise it in Topaz?
It doesn't change that.
Well, I start that first layer. Maybe I can go back. See. Bear with me a second.
Thanks, Tricia, because this was,
So all of these steps, there's a lot of course, there's a lot of steps here. And then the last thing is making a JPEG, which I crop and maybe perhaps sharpen and perhaps not. But if I do, that's where I do it. All of this is in RAW.
Right, it's all in raw, it's raw in denoise, it stays raw?
Yes.
It, it says TIFF when it comes out of denoise or sharpen.
Yeah, and when I send it over, it goes as a TIFF.
Oh, what's different is I'm using denoise in Photoshop. Let's see if, yeah, here you can see it. So I'm using it as a what do you call it, add-in to Photoshop. I don't do it separately. I find this works better for me. So here I am, I've just brought in the image in Photoshop, first layer. I made a copy and then brought in Topaz denoise to filter the noise on that image. So this is
And it-
still
And it's raw, oh, okay,
then-
yeah, I don't know what I'll do, okay.
That's a whole different thing.
And
That
then I
is-
just keep stacking as
I
you
mean,
go up to finish the image. And when I finally get to the top of the stack, and then I'm ready to, then at that point, I'll probably do a crop and flatten all those layers and turn it into a JPEG, save it as a JPEG.
You're also not going at all into Lightroom. You're using Camera Raw, you
Yes.
know, then going into
And-
Photoshop. And so effectively, it's almost like two separate programs as opposed to conjoined programs when we do Lightroom and then Photoshop.
Well,
And
it's
that might
it's
also
actually
be-
the same, Joel, because
Engine,
Camera Raw is basically the same processing engine that's used in Lightroom. But what's different is I'm using Windows File Manager for all my cataloging and searching images and so forth. So I don't use the catalog function in Lightroom. And since I don't use that catalog function, I just go straight from Windows File Manager, which is where all my files are, Adobe Bridge, which allows me to select the image that I'm interested in. Adobe Bridge automatically goes into Camera Raw. I think these are considered one program, in fact. And then, and that's where all the sliders are that you see in Lightroom. It's the same processing engine that Lightroom uses, the Adobe Camera Raw. And then when I'm ready to go into do any kind of local changes where the interesting stuff takes place, that's in Photoshop. And that's when I start building those layers up. That makes sense?
So basically you're using denoise and sharpen as plugins, right?
Correct. Yeah, absolutely correct. When I do sharpen, I pull that in at the very end on the JPEG, but it's a plugin in Photoshop.
Oh, you sharpen after you turn it to JPEG.
Yeah, I don't do any sharpening until I get to the final image.
Oh,
I had a trip, geographic trip, where we had to do a bunch of images for a book, and they made a big deal about the fact that don't do any sharpening, save everything, and then in fact, in some cases, they did the sharpening when they did the publication. And so I just kind of stayed with that approach. I don't sharpen until I've got the final image. It's all cropped, and then decide if it needs sharpening or not.
I had a question, Bill, about, you mentioned electronic shutter versus, I think you said mechanical shutter.
Right.
I don't know which cameras have which. How do you know if you've got the mechanical versus the electronic shutter?
Usually it'll call it silent mode when it's electronic. If you can hear it, it's mechanical. And when it's in silent mode, then it's completely electronic because it's only doing it as an electronic operation. So there's absolutely no moving parts with the.
And would that be like, I don't know, mirror up, or is it in a DSLR and a mirrorless camera? Is it only in mirrorless? I don't understand.
Well, I only have mirrorless, but I think, except for my film camera, but I would say, yeah, mirrorless will definitely have a silent mode as well as a mechanical shutter mode.
Okay.
If you have a single lens reflex, you got that big mirror to flop out of the way.
And you can do a mirror up shoot, but I don't do that. So
Yeah,
Well, you can do mirror up shoot, but not with a mirrorless camera, obviously.
Right.
But
right.
mirrorless cameras do have that 20 frames or 30 frames a second now they're getting up to.
Right. In fact, I think you talked about that as well,
Electronic.
using the higher speed.
Yeah.
Wait, can you clarify that, please? Because you lost me there. So what does that have to do with the silent mode?
Well, the silent mode, I'm referring to the camera, we'll probably call it silent mode. There's no mechanical action at
Yes.
all. It's the shutter action is entirely by scanning the electrons, scanning the image. And so it's completely vibration free.
Okay, that part I understood, but then Mike jumped in with, the increased frames per second, and that's where I got lost.
Yeah, in silent mode, typically you can go faster. It's faster
Okay,
than the mechanical.
Okay, thank you.
You'll have a faster frame rate. I think on my
Okay.
camera, I've got for the slow silent mode, it's like 20 frames per second or 18, and then the fast one is like 60 frames
Okay.
per second.
wow.
Oh, which is
I think I can clarify it a little. If you have a DSLR, the silent type mode, there's usually what's called a live mode. And when you go into the live mode, it locks the mirror in the up position. It doesn't flop up and down at all. You can't focus through the optical viewfinder, but
Right.
you do shot after shot, and there's no mirror moving.
exactly.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah,
But-
for the case of a single lens reflex, that's exactly right.
Yes, but that doesn't apply to a mirrorless.
For a mirrorless, you don't have that
Right.
mirror to flop up, but you still have a shutter,
Yes,
a mechanical shutter, or you can have an electronic shutter. Typically, you have both.
got it.
There's some distortion effects in electronic shutter that you have to worry about, but for the kind of pictures I take, it's worked out pretty well.
I'd say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill, I've got another topic for you that I don't know if you know a lot about, related to the native area of a sensor as it relates to the ISO, in that there is a correlation between the two to get the maximum amount of light hitting at a native ratio onto the sensor, and it varies between the size. In a Canon full frame, the native ISO to the sensor is not 100, I believe it's 160. And it's an interesting topic to go through, but you can get, it's another way of getting absolutely crisp photos.
And what's that called? What would I Google to research that?
It's the relationship of ISO to the native site. I'll have to look up the exact term and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm interested.
So, on that note, if you find out what the native ISO is for your particular sensor, and if you're in a situation where you're using a fixed ISO, for example, on my Canon camera, I will use ISOs of 160, 320, 480, multiples of that native size.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I was not familiar with the term native ISO. That's interesting. Oh, well.
Hey, Bill, I've got a question on your moon photo.
On which photo?
Yeah, I think it showed that you took 10 exposures and then stacked those 10.
Oh, the moon?
of the
Mhm.
moon. Were those 10 exposures, was that in a fast shutter mode? Or did you separate the shot by a second or two, or how did you do that?
About a second. So my camera has a feature that allows me to take 10 shots, one right after another. I just tell it to do that and then it does it.
Oh,
But you can also just do it manually, of course, it's the same way. That's why I happen to do these examples with just 10 shots because it was easier to do. But basically it's about half a second between shots.
okay, so the camera is going through an autofocus as well. You're not changing the focus at all.
Not changing anything. Yeah. It's already focused,
Right,
everything's set up. And then it's just 10 shots, exactly the same, about a second apart. And like in the case of the moon, this is at 1/800th of a second. But in the case of the horse, these were 15-second exposures.
Got it.
Same approach in both cases.
What was the aperture on the moon shot?
6.3, f6.3.
Hmm.
This is the full eclipse that we had in May. And so we had a really, really bright moon before the eclipse. This was taken like about 11 o'clock at night. And it was just blinding. It was amazing. So 1/800th of a second, ISO 200, you get plenty of light. But still, it's interesting, but still there's noise there in that image, in those darker areas that you can pull out with stacking.
I love that idea. That's great.
For those of you that would like to take a really sharp image of the moon, what people do is they drive up to the top of Mount Evans in Colorado.
Been there.
It's a 14,000 footer, and I've never done it, but I've read about it. And you just get it crystal clear. There's very little atmospheric effects. Here in Sonoma County, it's just so humid. It's really hard to get a sharp photo. So I've been trying it with 1 or 2 exposures, and it's tough. You really have to go through the stacking.
This was a good clear night. This was on the top of Bald Mountain in Sugarloaf Park.
Okay.
And it was very clear. I got some shots of the eclipse that night.
Cool.
If you like scary driving, one of the highest roads in America goes up near Mount Evans.
Wow. And what's the altitude again? What?
It's 14,000
Wow.
foot. So
You need to bring your oxygen tank.
That's what I was thinking.
you get above tree line. So tree line's about 12,000, and then it's a paved road. In fact, Steve is right.
The road will take you up above 14,000 feet.
Yeah, and it's been advertised as the highest paved road in the world. So it's actually a pretty easy drive if you don't mind looking over the cliffs a little bit.
Yeah, like Ronnie says, take your oxygen. I get a blinding headache at about 9,000 feet. So.
I lived in La Paz, Bolivia for 4 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And had a baby there.
There's a full moon tomorrow night.
Yeah, it's real close right now.
And then it'll be good to take Milky Way pictures.
Yeah, I need to get away from the light pollution. Try to get some good shots.
I mean, I went up with Steve Gibbs to Lake Sonoma the last moonless night. And there was a lot more light pollution than the previous time I had been there, which was 2 years before that.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with the Bortle scale?
Yes.
Which details how dark the sky is and free of light pollution.
Right.
Yes.
And we actually have a Bortle 0 not far from here.
Where?
Northwest Nevada. Massacre Rim is the area.
Nevada, right. Yeah.
Too smoky.
Yeah, a little smoky right now.
Way too smoky right now.
Yeah.
So can I just say one thing about the noise on a crop sensor
Sure.
versus a mirrorless? I bought Mike's old Canon R last year, and I had a Canon 77D, which is a crop sensor, and the difference in noise is astounding. It is truly astounding. I mean, I keep, trying to keep the ISO down as low as possible, and I don't need to. I can push it, keep pushing it, and I don't get noise. It's amazing.
Yeah. Bigger the sensor, the better. Also,
Yeah.
they're all getting better. My older cameras have a lot more noise for the same crop factor than the newer ones. It's just like pixels. It's all changing really rapidly.
Yeah.
So it's all getting better.
Yay.
Bill, that was so interesting
Well, thank
and so well done. I really want to thank you because it made a lot of stuff clearer to me. So
Thank
good
you. Thank you, Ann. Actually, I copied your talk. You gave us such a great talk a year ago.
you didn't copy mine.
I copied your title, your approach. everything.
I just love to hear about your adventures. I didn't know you were such a
Yeah, it was great. It was like a
outdoors
movie.
person.
I kept thinking about that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and the bear. I can't remember the name of it, but
And the bus.
All right.
I
Yeah.
remember that
oh,
one.
yeah.
We just watched an old movie that I think you like, Bill. It's called The Hunter,
Uh-huh.
and it stars Willem Dafoe. And he's out in the wild searching for the Tasmanian tiger.
Wow.
Mm.
And it's a little dated, the animation's not as good as it is today, but it has a really good message at the end. Yeah, I think you'd enjoy
I'll
it.
look for it. I like Willem Dafoe.
Yeah, The Hunter.
Okay.
Bill, I really appreciated how you put this together and all the topics you covered. Really well done.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, well done, Bill.
It's been fun.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Extremely well done. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.
Good night, everybody.
Great talk.
Want to see more Alaska?